What if I told you that Rome's greatest walls were not built to stop armies? We imagine them as stone barriers against which enemy waves crashed, but their true purpose was much more complex and ingenious. The Roman Empire stretched for thousands of kilometers, and defending such borders required not just walls, but a complex multi-layered system. These structures were not so much a shield as a filter, a tool of control, and a demonstration of power. They controlled trade, collected tolls, and shaped the very idea of a border. Watch the video to the end to find out how a simple signal tower could transmit a message hundreds of kilometers, and why the main enemy of the wall was not a siege engine, but an ordinary plow. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of Roman engineers. Their walls were primarily a psychological weapon. The term limes is often translated simply as border, but its meaning was much deeper. Originally, the word meant road or path, especially one laid by legionnaires in new territory. Over time, it came to refer to the entire border zone, a whole complex of fortifications, roads, towers, and forts. It was not a line on a map, but a living, functioning system. The Romans did not simply build a wall, they organized space, separating the Pax Romana, Roman peace, from the outside lands. The main purpose of the limes was to visually demonstrate power. Imagine a traveler approaching the border of the empire. He saw not just fields, but a clear, man-made line, a moat, a rampart, a palisade, or a stone wall stretching to the horizon. Above it rose watchtowers, spaced at regular intervals. This sight alone inspired thoughts of order, power, and the omnipresence of Rome. It made it clear where chaos ended and civilization began. Contrary to popular belief, the limes was not intended to stop a full-scale military invasion. A large army, if organized, could have broken through the wall in many places. The real purpose was different: to prevent small raids, cattle theft, and smuggling. The wall prevented quick, inconspicuous raids, which were the main tactic of many border tribes. It forced any intruder to linger, making them vulnerable to patrols. The wall was not a solid barrier, but a permeable membrane. It had strictly defined passages and gates. Anyone who wanted to cross the border, whether a merchant, diplomat, or peaceful migrant, had to pass through this checkpoint. Here, legionnaires inspected goods, collected customs duties, and registered visitors. Thus, the wall did not stop traffic, but took it under complete control. The limes also served as a foreign policy tool. Rome often formed alliances with tribes living just beyond the wall. These tribes, known as federates, received subsidies and trade privileges. In return, they pledged to defend the border from more distant and hostile groups. The wall thus became not an end, but the center of a complex diplomatic and economic zone. The uniqueness of the Roman approach lay in its standardization. No matter where you were, in Britain, Germany, or Syria, the principles of the limes were similar. Standard designs for forts, towers, and even the layout of border roads showed that this was a unified system managed from a single center. This unification amazed the imagination of contemporaries and served as another factor of psychological impact. Roman order was visible in everything. The Romans believed in their civilizing mission. The wall separated the world of order, laws, and aqueducts from the world they considered chaotic. The construction of the limes was an act of transforming wild nature into an organized space. Civilian settlements, vici, grew up around the forts and walls where craftsmen, merchants, and soldiers' families lived. The border became the center of a new life. The wall influenced not only foreign peoples, but also the Romans themselves. It gave the inhabitants of the empire a sense of security and stability. The knowledge that this insurmountable barrier, guarded by legions, stood at the far frontiers strengthened loyalty to the emperor. It was a physical manifestation of imperial power, a symbol of the indestructibility of the state. This system was effective as long as the empire was strong. It required constant maintenance, numerous garrisons, and sophisticated logistics. When central power began to weaken and resources were depleted, the limes turned from an instrument of control into a vulnerable line of defense. But for centuries, it was this idea, control, not isolation, that was the key to success. This border psychology was only the foundation. On this foundation, Roman engineers built structures that were astonishing in their effectiveness. We would love to hear your opinion. Do you think modern state borders serve the same psychological function as the Roman limes? Write about it in the comments and be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next videos. Are you ready to learn the truth that most Roman walls were not made of stone at all? The basis of border fortifications, especially in continental Europe, for example in Germany, was not a stone wall, but a combination of three elements: a ditch, a rampart, and a palisade. This system was quicker to build and required fewer resources than monumental masonry. The main task was not to stop, but to slow down as much as possible anyone who tried to cross the border in the wrong place. The first obstacle in the path of the intruder was a moat or fossa. Roman engineers were masters of earthworks. The moat was not just a ditch, it had a specific V shape. This shape prevented attackers from using it as cover and made it difficult to descend and ascend. A narrow gap, a foot ditch, was often left at the bottom to make it impossible to get a foothold and slow down movement. The size of the moat varied depending on the terrain and the level of threat. At the German limes, the moat could reach 2 to 3 meters in depth and 8 or 10 meters in width. The excavated earth was not wasted. It was used to create the next element of the fortification, the rampart. It was a waste-free and efficient production cycle. Each stage of the work was planned in advance. Immediately behind the moat, on the inner imperial side, an earthen rampart, agger or vallum, was built from the excavated soil. This rampart was tightly compacted and often reinforced with layers of turf, stones, or logs to prevent erosion. It created a second vertical obstacle that had to be overcome after the moat. The height of the rampart also added visibility for patrols. A palisade was erected on top of the earthen rampart. It consisted of thousands of pointed wooden stakes firmly driven into the ground and intertwined. The palisade could reach a height of 2 to 3 meters, making the total height of the obstacle, from the bottom of the ditch to the top of the stakes, quite impressive. Stakes were the main building material for the legions in the wooded areas of Germany. The logistics of constructing such a border were staggering. Millions of trees were required. The legionaries not only built, but also engaged in industrial-scale logging. The trees were processed, sharpened, and delivered to the construction site via specially laid military roads. It was a constant, methodical effort to develop the territory. In some places, to make the rampart even stronger, the Romans used an improved Celtic technique known as the Murus Gallicus, Gallic wall. It was a complex internal structure of intersecting wooden beams, with the space between them filled with earth and stones. The outside of the rampart was covered with stone or turf. This construction was incredibly stable. The wooden palisade and earthen rampart required constant maintenance. Wood rotted, earth crumbled. Repairing the fortifications was part of the daily routine of the garrison troops. Soldiers patrolled their sections, replacing rotten stakes and reinforcing eroded slopes of the rampart. It was a constant struggle with nature to maintain the integrity of the border. This three-part system was extremely effective against its primary target, small groups of raiders. They could not quickly drive cattle across the ditch and rampart. They could not sneak through without making noise. Any attempt to overcome the barrier required time, ladders and tools, and intruders became easy targets for patrols. The moat and rampart were the foundation, but they were blind. For the system to work, it needed eyes. What do you think was more important for building towers, stone or wood? In the next chapter, we'll talk about how the Romans created the most sophisticated surveillance system of antiquity. What if I told you that everything you believed about Hadrian's Wall wasn't entirely true? Its strength lay not in the wall, but in the towers. A monumental stone wall, such as Hadrian's Wall in Britain, was only the foundation. The real essence of the system was its towers. The Romans created an incredibly dense and standardized network of observation posts. There were two main types: small towers, called turrets, and small forts, called mile castles. Exactly every Roman mile, about 480 meters, a small fort, or mile castle, was built into the wall. This was a unique solution, characteristic of Britain. A mile castle was a small fortress measuring approximately 15 by 18 meters, with sturdy gates that opened both to the north, to the outer lands, and to the south to the territory of the empire. The mile castle served as a checkpoint and base for a small garrison. It housed between 8 and 32 soldiers. They controlled the gate through which all legal trade and movement of people took place. The presence of such frequent gates shows that the wall was intended for control rather than complete isolation. These were the customs and immigration posts of their time. Inside the Mille Castella were barracks for soldiers and possibly small warehouses. The gates were massive, wooden, and most likely topped by a tower for better visibility. The Mille Castella garrison was responsible not only for the gates, but also for patrolling the section of the wall up to the next fort. Between each pair of mile castles, the Romans built 2 watchtowers or turrets. They were located at equal distances from each other, approximately 500 meters, 1/3 of a Roman mile. This created incredible surveillance density. There was a fortified structure every half kilometer along the border. No one could approach the wall unnoticed. A turret was a small stone tower protruding from the wall. Its dimensions were modest, about 4 by 4 meters at the base. The tower probably had several floors. The lower floor was used for rest and storage of supplies, and the upper floor was an open observation deck protected by battlements. From here, there was a view for many kilometers. Inside the turret, a small detachment, probably 4 to 6 soldiers from the nearest mile castle, carried out their duties. They took turns keeping watch over the surrounding area around the clock. Conditions were Spartan, cramped quarters, constant wind and rain in northern Britain. This service required endurance and constant vigilance. The entire system was designed with direct visibility in mind. From each tower, it was possible to see 2 neighboring towers and the nearest mile castles. This was the basis for the signaling system. Any suspicious movement spotted from one tower could be immediately relayed along the chain. Hadrian's Wall itself served not only as a barrier, but also as a protected patrol road. Soldiers could quickly move along the top of the wall from turret to turret without descending to the ground. This allowed reinforcements to be quickly transferred to the threatened area. The wall was a means of communication. This unique system of mile castles and turrets made the wall in Britain the most controlled section of the border in the entire empire. It was a true smart wall of antiquity. Like this video if you learned something new, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new videos about the history of ancient Rome. Guess how long it took the Romans to build an entire city in the middle of the wilderness? The wall and towers were only the first line of defense. The real military power of the limes was located behind them, in large legionary fortresses, or castra. These were not just barracks, but full-fledged military cities designed to accommodate thousands of soldiers, including cavalry and auxiliary troops. The genius of Roman military engineering lay in standardization. Every Roman fort, wherever it was located, was built according to a uniform rectangular plan resembling a city block grid. 2 main streets intersected in the center, Via Principalis and Via Praetoria. This standardization allowed a legion arriving from another part of the empire to immediately orient itself and take up its positions. At the very heart of the fort, at the intersection of the main streets, was the Principia, the headquarters. It was the administrative and symbolic core of the fortress. It housed the commander's offices, the archives, and most importantly, the Castellum, a sanctuary where the legion's standards and eagles were kept. Next to the headquarters was the Praetorium, the residence of the legate, or commander of the fort. It was a luxurious house built in the style of an Italian villa. It often had an inner courtyard with a garden, private baths, and richly decorated rooms. This demonstrated the Roman standard of living and the immutability of power even in the wildest frontiers. Most of the fort was occupied by barracks or contubernia. They were organized into long blocks, each of which was intended for 1 centuria, 80 men. Each centuria was divided into 10 contubernia, groups of 8 men, each of which had its own pair of rooms, one for equipment and the other for sleeping. A critically important element of the fort was the horea, or granaries. These were special buildings constructed with engineering ingenuity. They had floors raised above the ground to protect against rodents and moisture, as well as special ventilation systems in the walls. The grain supply was supposed to allow the garrison to withstand a long stay in isolation. Each large fort had its own military hospital, a valetudinarium, with operating rooms and wards for the sick. In addition, baths or thermae were a mandatory feature. The baths were not only a place for hygiene, but also the main social center where soldiers rested, socialized, and regained their strength after service. The fort itself was surrounded by its own fortifications, even if it was located behind the main wall of the limes. It had its own moat, rampart, and stone walls with towers. The fort's gates were strong and well protected. It was a fortress within a fortress, the last line of defense for the garrison. The garrisons of these forts were a mobile reserve. While the auxiliaries, support troops, carried out patrol duty on the wall, the legionaries in the castra were ready to respond quickly. If the alarm signaled a major breach, cohorts from the fort could immediately move to the threatened section. The forts were the brain and muscle of the frontier, ensuring its functioning. They were complex engineering projects that required enormous resources. What do you think was the most important element of a fort for the survival of the garrison? In the next chapter, we will discuss how the legions built these fortifications. The Roman army was not only a fighting force, but also the greatest engineering corporation of antiquity. Legionnaires spent more time with pickaxes and shovels than with swords. Building and maintaining the limes was one of their main responsibilities. Every soldier was a skilled builder, carpenter, and surveyor. The discipline and organization of the legions made them the ideal tool for large-scale projects. Any construction began with the work of the grammatici, or surveyors, using tools such as the groma, for marking right angles, and the shorebat, a long spirit level. They marked out the plan of the future wall, moat, or fort with incredible accuracy. It is to them that we owe the perfectly straight sections of Roman borders and roads. Their calculations were astonishingly accurate. Stone walls such as Hadrian's Wall required millions of tons of stone. The legions organized quarries near the construction line. Soldiers cut blocks using wedges and hammers. Many stones of Hadrian's Wall still bear inscriptions left by the centurions who quarried them. It was hard physical work that required hundreds of hands. A huge amount of wood was needed for the palisades, towers, gates, and rampart frames. The legions set up entire sawmills. Soldiers felled trees, processed logs, and delivered them to the construction site. It was hard and dangerous work that required the coordination of entire units. The forests on the border of the empire were thinning under the onslaught of builders. Digging trenches and building ramparts was the main task. Legionnaires worked in shifts using standard tools, dolabra, pickaxes, and woven baskets for carrying earth. The work was carried out at a methodical pace. It has been calculated that one legion, working in coordination, could build several kilometers of ramparts per day under favorable conditions. The legion included specialists, immunes. These were soldiers who were exempt from regular duties in order to perform skilled work. Among them were masons, carpenters, blacksmiths, and engineers. They supervised construction and performed the most complex tasks such as building arches or laying walls. The limes would have been useless without a network of roads. Parallel to the wall on the inside, there was always a military road. It connected all the forts, mile castles, and towers. This allowed patrols and reserves to move quickly along the border. These roads were built using the same technology as the famous Roman highways, with a multi-layered foundation. The construction and maintenance of garrisons required enormous logistical support. Food, weapons, clothing, and building materials were all delivered from the interior of the empire. Rivers such as the Rhine and Danube served as the main transport arteries, along which barges delivered cargo to the border forts. Without this logistics, the system would have collapsed. During construction in new territory, the legion erected a fortified camp every night. This camp was built according to the same standard plan as a permanent fort, but out of earth and wood. This protected the builders and allowed them to start work immediately the next morning. Discipline was the key to everything. The engineering power of the legions was the foundation of Roman defense. They did not simply occupy territory, they immediately developed it, rebuilding it to Roman standards. This ability to build quickly and well made the limes so reliable. Every legionary was not only a soldier, but also a builder. What if I showed you how the Romans sent text messages 2,000 years before the invention of the telephone? The strongest walls and the tallest towers are useless if they cannot communicate a threat in time. The Romans understood this and created a complex signaling system that was the nervous system of the limes. This system allowed messages to be transmitted over vast distances at remarkable speeds. The system was based on direct visibility. As we have already mentioned, the towers and turrets were built so that each one could see the two neighboring ones. This continuous chain of posts was an optical telegraph. A signal sent from one tower was immediately duplicated at the next one. In this way, the message flew along the border. During the day, smoke was the main means of transmitting signals. Thick black smoke from burning wet straw or branches was clearly visible from a distance. Different numbers of smoke columns or their intermittent nature could encode different messages. For example, one column meant all is quiet, two meant enemy sighted. Fire signals were used at night. Special braziers or torches were installed at the tops of the towers. The bright flames could be seen for many kilometers. As with smoke, the number of fires or their flashing, by covering the flame with a shield, could convey coded information. This system required constant vigilance from the garrisons. Simple codes were used for basic messages. One column of smoke or one torch could mean a small group has been spotted. Two columns could mean alert, a large detachment has been spotted, support is needed. These were pre-agreed signals that every soldier on the wall could understand. There were also more complex systems. The Greek historian Polybius described a complex optical telegraph that used water clocks and torches to transmit letter messages. Although we have no direct evidence of its widespread use at Limassol, the technology itself was known. It is possible that more complex codes were used to transmit reports at key locations. For short distances, such as between neighboring turrets or to alert patrols, sound signals were used. The Romans used horns such as the cornu or tuba. The sharp, loud sounds of these instruments carried far and served as an alarm or command. Not all information could be conveyed by fire. Couriers were used for detailed reports. Along the military road between the forts, cursori or runners, and cavalrymen from special reconnaissance units, exploratories, traveled back and forth. They ensured the delivery of written reports to headquarters. The speed of the optical telegraph was incredible. It is estimated that an alarm signal could travel along Hadrian's Wall from one coast to the other, about 120 kilometers, in less than an hour. This gave the garrisons in the forts enough time to prepare and move out to intercept the enemy. This fast and reliable communication turned scattered garrisons into a single organism. The wall came alive, responding to threats in real time. How effective do you think this system was compared to modern means of communication? In the next chapter, we will talk about how the wall affected the daily lives of people on both sides of it. One of the main but often overlooked functions of the limes was economic. The wall was not so much a military barrier as a customs and economic barrier. It was created to control all cross-border trade, which was quite lively. The Roman Empire was a huge market, and goods from the Barbaricum were in high demand. Control was exercised through official checkpoints located in mile castles and large forts. Any merchant wishing to import their goods into the empire had to pass through these gates. Here their goods were inspected, evaluated, and taxed with a duty known as portorium. This system was strictly regulated. The collection of these duties was an important source of income for the imperial treasury. In fact, the limes could pay for itself through customs duties. Garrisons performed not only military but also fiscal functions, ensuring compliance with trade legislation. Smuggling was a serious problem, and patrols on the wall tracked down those who tried to bypass customs. What was brought into the empire? Amber from the Baltic, leather, furs, and livestock came through limes. In the opposite direction, Roman goods were transported to the Barbaricum: wine, olive oil, ceramics, glassware, weapons, and coins. The Roman coin was a universal currency far beyond the borders. Archaeologists find Roman coins all over Europe. The presence of thousands of soldiers on the border created a huge market in itself. Legionnaires needed food, clothing, shoes, and household items. This stimulated economic development in the inland areas adjacent to the limes. Farmers and craftsmen prospered by fulfilling orders for the army. Right next to the fort walls, civilian settlements called vici sprang up like mushrooms after rain. Initially, these were temporary camps for merchants, market vendors, and craftsmen serving the garrison. Over time, they turned into real towns with stone houses, temples, and taverns. Life was bustling at the foot of the walls. These vici were bustling with life. They were home to soldiers' families, veterans who had been given land, and locals attracted by the opportunities. The vici were a melting pot where Roman culture mixed with local traditions. It was here that the most active Romanization of the border provinces took place. The wall not only divided but also attracted people. It created an area of stability and economic activity. Many of today's European cities, especially on the Rhine and Danube, e.g. Cologne, Vienna, Budapest, grew out of Roman legionary fortresses and the vici adjacent to them. Thus, the limes was not only an instrument of defense, but also of integration. It slowly but surely drew the border peoples into Rome's economic and cultural orbit. Peaceful trade through the gates of the wall often proved to be a more effective means of pacification than military expeditions. This complex economic and social system was as important an element of defense as the wall itself. It created a zone of mutual interests, reducing the motivation for raids. The limes was not just a barrier, but a facade, a showcase of the Roman world, demonstrating its wealth and order. Who served on these distant frontiers? At the height of the empire's power, the limes garrisons consisted of two main types of troops, legionaries and auxiliaries. Legionaries remained the backbone of the Roman army, but in everyday life on the frontier, it was the auxiliaries who manned most of the posts and performed the most routine but important tasks. They patrolled long sections of the wall, watched the towers, and made sure no one crossed the border without permission. The legionaries, on the other hand, were stationed in large forts and acted as a mobile reserve that could quickly move to where the situation became dangerous. This division of responsibilities made the limes stable and allowed vast territories to be kept under control. The auxiliaries were auxiliary troops recruited from non-citizens of Rome, i.e., from the inhabitants of conquered or allied provinces. This was a carefully thought-out policy that helped to strengthen the empire's power over new lands while making use of the best abilities of local warriors. Soldiers from Spain could find themselves on the Rhine, and natives of Gaul and Britain, and this practice severed their ties with their homelands, reducing the risk of rebellion. Far from home, they became more dependent on Rome and therefore more loyal to its interests. The Romans understood that foreign soldiers under the command of Roman officers would be less inclined to engage in local conflicts and intrigues. This system not only allowed them to maintain their borders, but also to spread the influence of the Roman way of life. Service in the auxiliary units was hard and required great endurance, but the reward for it was truly enormous. After completing 25 years of service, an auxiliary soldier received full Roman citizenship, which gave him access to the privileges and rights enjoyed by the inhabitants of the metropolis. This citizenship also extended to his children, which immediately raised the family's social status and gave it a new status. In a world where legal status determined almost all aspects of life, such a reward was a powerful incentive for loyalty and hard work. Many young men from the provinces joined the army not only for the sake of earning a living, but also for the sake of their descendants' future. Rome's approach made military service one of the most important tools of Romanization. Auxiliary cohorts and alliae, i.e., cavalry units, were renowned for their specialization in certain types of combat operations. Rome knew how to use the natural and cultural characteristics of different peoples, so Syrian archers were placed where long-range weapons were needed, and Gallic cavalry was sent to areas where rapid cavalry strikes could decide the outcome of a battle. Germanic spearmen served where heavy infantry had to be countered, and their skills were considered among the best in the empire. The placement of such units along the limes was well thought out and took into account the characteristics of the terrain and threats. Their ability to preserve their national traditions made them particularly effective in battle. The Romans understood that diversity of skills was a tremendous strength. The daily routine of a soldier on the border, for example on Hadrian's Wall, was monotonous but required strict discipline. The main duty consisted of 4-hour shifts on the towers, observing the distant hills and checking the areas between the turrets. Soldiers had to be alert to the slightest changes: smoke on the horizon, unfamiliar silhouettes, or movements near the wall. After their shifts, they cleaned their weapons and checked the condition of their equipment, as any malfunction could spell disaster in the event of a sudden attack. Night shifts were particularly difficult because the darkness increased the risk of missing enemy movements. Such service kept the soldiers in a constant state of readiness. Life in the barracks of small millicastles or large forts was strictly regulated and subject to army rules. Soldiers lived in cramped rooms that housed 8 people and shared the space so that everyone had room for their weapons, clothes, and personal belongings. They cooked their meals on a communal brazier, which created an atmosphere of brotherhood and helped to unite the group. Daily training kept them physically fit and skilled, and their commanders ensured that no one shirked their duties. They spent their free time in baths, which were an important part of Roman culture, or in taverns in the neighboring vicus, a small settlement near the fort. Such socializing helped relieve the stress of heavy duty. In the later period of the empire, especially from the 3rd to 4th centuries, the nature of the border army changed significantly. Limitani, border soldiers who differed from the former professional legionaries, appeared. They received plots of land along the limes, and their lives became closely linked to farming. This turned them into a kind of peasant warriors who had to work their fields and defend the border at the same time. This system allowed people to remain on the frontier permanently while reducing the burden on the state treasury. However, their level of training was lower than that of soldiers in the early empire, as most of their time was spent on economic activities. Limitani lived with their families in forts and settlements along the limes, which made them deeply rooted in these places. Their homes were located near fortifications, and they knew every path, forest, and hill within their territory. They were firmly attached to the land and defended not only the border, but also their own farms, which made them staunch defenders. Their task was to repel small raids, delay the enemy, and hold the line until the comitati, mobile field armies, arrived. These units could quickly come to the rescue and engage larger enemy forces. This two-tiered system provided flexibility, but made the defense fragile in the face of large-scale invasions. This system of land and local service allowed Rome to save resources, but at the same time created new problems. The Limitani were interested in protecting their settlements and served conscientiously, but their numbers and training were often insufficient to repel serious threats. During large-scale invasions, they had to withstand the onslaught until the main forces arrived, which was extremely dangerous. Nevertheless, they became an essential part of late frontier life, combining the hard work of a farmer with the duties of a soldier. Their existence shaped a unique way of life in which war and agriculture were inextricably linked. This model persisted for many generations. The people who lived on the wall, whether they were auxiliaries during the heyday or Limitani in later centuries, were the first generation of people who could be called Europeans in a broad cultural sense. They were Romans in their service, lifestyle, and discipline, but their roots lay in the most diverse provinces of the empire. Here on the border, they created a unique civilization that combined Roman organization with the local customs and traditions of many peoples. This border culture lasted for centuries and influenced the development of regions that later became the foundation of early medieval Europe. New communities were born in limes, languages and customs mixed. All this created a world that was both Roman and multinational. The most famous and impressive section of the Roman limes is undoubtedly Hadrian's Wall in northern England. Built on the orders of Emperor Hadrian around 122 AD, it crosses the island from coast to coast for 117 kilometers. It was not just a rampart, but a monumental stone wall, the pinnacle of Roman frontier engineering. The decision to build it was made after Hadrian's visit to Britain. He abandoned further expansion northward and decided to secure the border. The wall was not only a defensive, but also a political gesture, a demonstration that Rome had established its limit. It was built by 3 legions stationed in Britain. Initially, the plan was ambitious. A wall 3 meters wide and up to 5-6 meters high, built of hewn stone. However, the plan changed during construction. To speed up the work, the width of the wall was reduced to 2.5 meters in many sections. This shows that even the Romans did not have unlimited resources and had to adapt. As we have already mentioned, a unique feature of Hadrian's Wall was its system of mile castles and turrets. This dense network of control was supplemented by 16 large forts, located either on the wall itself or close to it. Forts such as Houstons or Windolanda housed garrisons of 500,000 men. Another mysterious feature is the so-called vallum, located south of the wall. This is not a wall but a huge earthwork, a deep ditch with a flat bottom, flanked by two high earthen ramparts. Its purpose is still disputed. It was probably a demarcation line separating the military zone of the wall from the rest of the province. At its eastern end, the wall reached the fort of Arbaya, modern South Shields, in which was a naval base. This emphasizes that the Limes was an integrated system that included a fleet. The River Tyne was also part of the system, with forts controlling the waterway. The Romans thought comprehensively. At the western end, the wall continued with a series of fortifications along the coast of Cumbria. These were forts and towers designed to prevent flanking maneuvers by sea. The Romans took into account all possible routes of penetration. The system was closed and comprehensive. The construction was carried out by legionaries, but the garrison service was performed by auxiliaries. Soldiers from all over the empire served in the forts of Hadrian's Wall, Batavi from Holland, Tungri from Belgium, Asturians from Spain. It was a truly international contingent, united by Roman service. Hadrian's Wall was not a static line. It was rebuilt and repaired several times. For a short time, the Romans even advanced further north and built the Antonine Wall. But in the end, they always returned to Hadrian's stone barrier as the most reliable border. Today, Hadrian's Wall is a World Heritage Site. Its ruins, stretching across the rugged landscapes of northern England, remain the most vivid testimony to Rome's engineering genius and its ambitions to organize the world. It still makes a lasting impression. Hadrian's Wall was the pinnacle of engineering, but it was not the only solution. Different sections of the border required different approaches. A striking example is the Antonine Wall, built further north in Scotland around 142 AD on the orders of Emperor Antoninus Pius. It reflected a new surge of imperial ambition. Unlike the stone Hadrian's Wall, the Antonine Wall was built mainly of turf. It was a high earthen rampart erected on a stone foundation, about 4 meters wide and up to 3 to 4 meters high. On the northern side, it was covered by a wide and deep moat. It was a faster and cheaper construction. This border was shorter, only 63 kilometers, but was organized differently. Instead of the mile castle turret system, the Romans built about 19 forts located closer to each other. It was a more aggressive and concentrated line of defense, with a large number of troops on the line itself. The Antonine Wall did not last long. The legions held it for only about 20 years, after which the border was moved back to Hadrian's Wall. The turf construction proved to be less durable and required constant repair in the damp climate of Scotland. Pragmatism ultimately prevailed over ambition. We see a completely different approach at the Upper German Rhaetian Limes, which defended the border between the Rhine and the Danube. For hundreds of kilometers, there were no stone or turf walls here. The original border was simply a patrol road lined with wooden towers. Later, in the 2nd century, this line was fortified. In Germany, it was a continuous earthen rampart with a moat and a palisade on top, very similar to the early fortifications. This system was effective in wooded areas where wood was the main building material. In Raetia, southern part, the Romans built not a rampart, but a real stone wall 3 to 4 meters high. But unlike Hadrian's Wall, it was simpler. It had neither millicastels nor turrets built into the wall itself. It was simply a barrier demonstrating the boundary of the empire. Surveillance and defense on the German limes were carried out from towers and forts located behind the wall. Stone or wooden watchtowers stood within sight of each other, but were separated from the barrier itself. Small forts, castella, were located at intervals of several kilometers. This approach demonstrates the flexibility of Roman engineers. They did not use a single template, but adapted basic principles, moat, rampart, towers, forts, to local conditions. In Britain, where a narrow isthmus needed to be controlled, they built a monumental wall. In Germany, where the border was long, they relied on cheaper ramparts. All these systems collapsed not because their design was poor. They fell when the empire could no longer maintain them. There were not enough soldiers for the garrisons, money for repairs, or political will to hold the borders. The wall was only as strong as the legion behind it. We have seen that Roman walls were not just piles of stones, but complex systems. They were economic filters, psychological barriers, customs posts, and high-tech, for their time, lines of communication. Their purpose was not to stop the world, but to organize it, subjecting it to Roman order. The engineering genius invested in the construction of moats, ramparts, forts, and signal towers still amazes the imagination. Legionnaires were not only warriors, but also great builders who literally drew the boundaries of civilization for hundreds of kilometers. The legacy of Limes is not just ruins. It is the very idea of a clear, controlled, and manageable border, which is the basis of many modern states. We are very interested to know what other engineering or military wonders of ancient Rome you would like to learn about. Perhaps you are interested in aqueducts, siege engines, or Roman roads. Suggest topics for future videos in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new research into the past.